Right-wing Democrats and plenty of Republicans are asking President Biden where he'll get the money to fund his $2 trillion infrastructure plan. My next guest has some ideas on that topic. Joining me now is Professor of Economics and New York Times bestselling author of The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory, and the Birth of the People's Economy, Stephanie Kelton. Welcome back to the show. It's great to see you.
Nice to see you. Thanks for having me back.
So I want to start at sort of the high level here with you, and then we can dig into some of the specifics. It's kind of annoyed me how some of the tax increases here were framed just as a pay for. When, first of all, if there's anything you don't need to pay for, it's infrastructure, because it's literally an investment that provides a return and helps increase the productivity of the country. But I would just love to get your thoughts on kind of the way this whole thing has been framed.
I mean, first, you're exactly right with respect to infrastructure and how frustrating the debate has been. We all know that Congress has spun out multi-trillion-dollar spending packages for the last year or so, right? We had this huge package in March of last year. The CARES Act was $2.2 trillion. It wasn't, quote unquote, paid for. We got the $900 billion at the end of last year in December, another big package, no offsets, wasn't paid for. And then last month, we got the COVID rescue plan, $1.9 trillion, again, not, quote unquote, paid for. Now here we are talking about infrastructure, the kinds of investments that we need to make in this economy, everything from the physical to the human infrastructure. And now we're having this pay for. We're getting bogged down in this question of where will the revenue come from? How are we going to fully offset all of the proposed spending so as not to add to the deficit? So we're right back where we haven't been for the last year, but we are now starting to worry about things like the deficit.
Well, and here's the other piece of this is I support raising taxes on the wealthy. I wish Biden would go further, actually, than what he proposed, 28. It looks like they're probably going to land at 25% in terms of increasing the corporate tax rate. The next package that has universal pre-K and free community college and some other things, they're talking about increasing taxes on the wealthy. We don't have the details there yet. I support those things, but not as a pay for. I support them because I think inequality is something to be combated. I think the wealthy, especially during coronavirus, have sucked up so much. I mean, they did incredibly well, even as most of the population suffered. So I think it should be framed more as a good thing in and of itself versus just a means to be able to pay for infrastructure or pay for preschool.
I'm with you 1,000%. I think these ought to be separate discussions instead of pairing the spending fight with the tax fight so that, in order to get the spending done, when you play the game, this pay for game that we're attempting to play now, you essentially have to pick and win two separate fights. You have to convince enough of your colleagues in the House and in the Senate to vote for the spending priorities, but you also have to convince them to vote for all of the increases in the taxes that are going to, quote unquote, pay for the spending. And I think you're exactly right. I think we ought to break these into two separate fights. We ought to talk about how to change the tax code, what we can do to close loopholes and deal with, the increasing concentrations of wealth and income inequality in this country, and address that deliberately and as a separate question, right? Instead of saying just how much can we peel off of the wealthy to come up with enough revenue to cover the cost of the proposed spending. Because quite frankly, I think we would have a much more aggressive tax debate, and we would go after concentrations of wealth and income more aggressively if we were thinking just specifically, how do we want to reshape the tax code so that we can get at these concentrations and deal with inequality? What kind of a world do we want to live in terms of how much inequality do we want to allow to continue to accumulate? So I think it's the right thing to do. Pick two different fights, go after the tax code and do a piece of legislation that deals with that and do the spending separately.
I think that's such a great point. The question we should be asking is not what's the bare minimum we can take from rich people to fund this. It should be blue sky. What does a just taxation system actually look like? Rather than having the confines of the debate be about how do we get just this amount of money to be able to pay for these things that we want to do right now. Another thing that I think is really important that you've pointed to and the Biden administration seems to want to deal with in the next package is enforcement. We know that rich people and corporations get away with, not only have they like rigged the tax code so they have all kinds of loopholes that they can benefit from, but then even the things that they're supposed to pay, they're not paying, and the IRS in many cases isn't coming after them. There's a tax gap of somewhere around $1 trillion, the IRS commissioner recently said. Talk about some of the disparities in taxation enforcement and what can be done there.
Isn't that incredible? So just last week, the IRS commissioner testifies before Congress, and he says, if we had the resources that we need to adequately, enforce the existing tax laws, we're not talking about raising taxes on anyone. He's just talking about enforcing the tax laws that are already on the books. And he said, if we had the resources that we need, we could probably come up with an additional $1 trillion a year in revenue just by enforcing the tax laws that are on the books. Now, you think about that, you say $1 trillion a year. Well, usually Congress quotes things in 10-year horizons. So that's $10 trillion over the course of the next decade. So when you think about it that way, you think, wow, here's President Biden talking about, 3, maybe getting close to $4 trillion in spending once we have the jobs plan and the family plan and we add it all up. And we're struggling to figure out, how many different ways can we generate revenue to cover this 3 or 4 trillion. And here's the IRS commissioner saying, the rich are getting away with not filing their taxes and paying what they already owe because we don't have the ability to go after them and hold them accountable. So they're getting away with essentially depriving the federal government of about $1 trillion in revenue every year. And, the no-brainer sort of low-hanging fruit here is step up enforcement. And you're looking at potentially $1 trillion a year that you can say, this is my pay for all of these things. It just makes it much cleaner. And it seems so obvious to me that that's, the place to go when you're looking for trillions of dollars of revenue to offset spending. If you're going to play this traditional pay for game, there's your low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, that's such an important point. The last question I have for you, Professor, is do you feel like your work has influenced this administration and that they've taken a different approach to deficits and debt than, say, the Obama administration did, that, of course, Joe Biden was a part of?
I mean, I don't know how much credit to try to take. I think that, I think it's not just my work. I think it's a collective effort on the part of a group of economists that for now a quarter of a century have been working to push the policy debate in a different direction, away from this, idea that the federal government faces a hard budget constraint the way a household or a business does, and to really shift the focus away from trying to think about what can we do to avoid adding to the deficit. And we've been saying all along, it's not about avoiding adding to the deficit. It's about using the spending, using the government's capacity to spend money effectively, right, to try to solve problems in the economy and to do it in a way that is respectful of the fact that there is an inflation constraint. And so we don't have to worry about a budget constraint, but we do have to worry about limits. And inflation is the punishment for overspending. And I do feel like, the debate that we're now getting to is much more in line with the way that we've been arguing for a number of decades. And you hear, people in the White House are thinking about the package in terms of inflation rather than so much worrying about, crude measures of deficits or the impact on the debt.
That is very encouraging to hear. Professor, great to have you as always. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.